My name is Robert Stevenson. I was born on the 16th of October 1803, but this story is not about me. It's about my father, George Stevenson. You haven't heard of him? You might not know the man, but you will know of his work. With coal, fire and steam, he changed the way that the working man had to work, made their lives easier, made it easier for them to travel in this great country of ours. He was my father, the father of the railways, George Stevenson. My father was born in Wylam in Northumberland on the 9th of June 1781. At that time, life revolved around the pit, the coal pit. My grandfather, Robert, was a miner, and my father was going to be a miner too. Everywhere needed coal, and my grandfather worked on the steam-driven engines that sucked the water from out of the tunnels so far under the ground, the steam engines that had been developed by Newcomen and by James Watt. They took the water from out of the pits to make it safe for men to work in that place. And my grandfather was a fireman, which meant that he shoveled the coal into the great hungry engines. He and my grandmother lived with their 6 children in a small cottage. And apart from George, my father, they were all as thin as twigs. But my father was big and strong and hearty and healthy. One of my father's first jobs was to keep his younger sisters and brothers away from the wooden tramways that ran not 2 foot away from the front of their cottage. Horses would drag great wagons that were filled with coal along that way, and it was his job to make sure that he kept his brothers and his sisters safe and away from the horses that pulled the wagons. Looking after his brothers and sisters wasn't the only work that he did. When he was aged 8, he herded cows, he led horses at the plough, he hoed turnips and did anything that he could to earn money. The work at the pit was good as long as there was coal under the ground. But every family had to follow the work. They had to go to the next winning, the next new shaft that had been sunk, to go for coal. And they would go because the coal mine owners would tell them that they had to. My father George had lots of different jobs at all of the different pits. When he was 10, he drove horses on the tramways for 2pence a day. He became a picker on the screen. That means that he pulled the stones from out of the coal at the top of the pit. And he did this all for 6pence a day. He worked as a picker until he was 14, and then he was a man. At 14, he became an assistant fireman to my grandfather, and for this he got £15 and 12 shillings a year. That was all he got, but it was still good money for a 14-year-old. But George always wanted to be in charge of the great steam machines, and he had set his heart on being the plug man. Now, the plug man was the man who actually was in charge of the steam-driven engines. And when he came home at night, he would make models of the engines out of wood and of clay. My father was fascinated by the engines that he worked on, and in his spare time he would take them apart to find out how they worked, how they were made, and how he could make them more efficient. When he was learning about the engines, he couldn't always work at the same pit as my grandfather Robert. But when they did come back to work together at Newburn, he was in charge of the pumping engine and in charge of my grandfather. George, he soon helped on all of the machines, and he worked on the winding machine that raised and lowered the men into the pit. He was what was called a brakeman. But not everyone was happy in the way that he worked at this. They all said that he was too young, and there was one man in particular, Ned Nelson, who was known as the battling coalman from Black Callerton. He challenged my father to a fight. He was much older than my father, but my father won. When he was 18, George knew that he would have to learn a little bit more. He would have to learn how to read and how to write, for everything that he learned was only by what he'd heard. So for 3 years, he taught himself how to read and to write. And it did take him 3 years to learn the basics of reading and writing. But my father had great ambition, and he wanted to get on as an engineer, mechanic and an inventor. He was supported by many people, but I've got to tell you, he hated the way that they spoke about him as a poor, untutored pitman. They spoke about him in this way even when he was famous and wealthy. But when he was 21, my father proposed to Frances Hindmarsh, a servant at a nearby farm in Newburn, and they were married at the local church on November the 28th, 1802. They rode the 15 miles on a horse after they had been married to Willington Quay, a horse that they'd borrowed from a local farmer. Now, I was born on the 16th of October, 1803, but my mother was ill for a long time afterwards. My father had gone to Newburn because he was asked by the engine maker Robert Hawthorne to look after the stationary engines that pulled the heavy coal wagons up and down the hills and slopes beside the pit. Robert Hawthorne had a lot of faith in my father and believed in his skills and abilities as an engineer and a mechanic. I've got to tell you, though, that in later life, my father gave Hawthorne little thanks for all of his help when he was younger. In 1804, my mother gave birth to my little sister at Killingworth, Frances. Fanny, she was called. But she died 3 weeks later, and my mother died the following year, aged only 37. My father was now a widower at 25, and I was left with a neighbour while he went away to Scotland to find work. When he did come back, I was looked after by my Aunt Eleanor, Auntie Nellie, and it was she who brought me up after my father returned. My father, he fixed the expensive water pumping machine at Newcomen, but the men he was in charge of were much older than him, and they did not like being told what to do by a younger man, an uneducated pitman. Everyone started to notice him and knew that he was a brilliant worker and a good engineer, but he knew that he needed to be able to read all of the new scientific books that were being written. So he sent me to school, and I would ride to school on a cuddy, a horse, because I would come back with all of my school books, and at night I would teach him all that I'd learned during the day. When I had finished my schooling, Aunt Nellie left, and she was married herself, and my father proposed to his first sweetheart, Elizabeth Hindmarsh. He was quite a catch then. In 1820, he was earning £200 a year. Now, one of the biggest problems in the pit was the threat of exploding coal damp gas. And my father, when he was a brakeman, had seen many disasters. So he decided, by trial and error, to make a lamplight that would be safer than the exposed candle flames that the miners used at that time. He came up with the idea of a miner's lamp, a lamp that would not cause the coal damp to explode, and he showed his invention in December 1815 at the Literary and Philosophical Society Library in Newcastle. But wealthy, famous, Sir Humphrey Davy, had also been asked